Hi, everyone. My name is Dale Schlunt, and for some time now, I've wanted to speak about a topic that is seemingly so simple. There are many ways to misunderstand it because it seems that simple, and that is the origins or the catalyst for the American Revolution. What is that very well-known and famous phrase that we've all been taught since childhood that's supposed to describe the reasons for this conflict? And that is that the British colonists in the Americas, or the American colonists, argued to the British Parliament and the Crown that we want no taxation without representation. We've all been taught this, and certainly it is a catchy phrase. Unfortunately, by itself, it is a fallacy. In other words, there's truth in that. Yet unless we understand the context, the many complexities that are surrounding this, what is happening during that time, but also centuries before, then we truly cannot simply just use that short phrase to fully describe the origins of this conflict. Let me prove it to you before you discount this argument. The American colonists, for the previous century before the the American Revolution or more, had always been taxed. And they never had representation. In other words, they never sent someone that was elected in the American colonies to sit in that body called Parliament and represent them. Of course, based on that, one could simply infer that, well, one day colonists must have woken up and said in the mid-18th century, after a century of being taxed without representation, this isn't right. I'm tired of this. I want representation now. As if it was just something spontaneous out of the blue. And of course, that is not the case. So of course, it leads one to further ask, so what is different in the mid-18th century? What changes that leads to this? And the first answer that we should find, and it's something that I asked my undergraduate students on their final exam. I asked them to tell me the origins, the catalyst for the American Revolution using one word that starts with a D. And that word is debt. Debt from the French and Indian War, or what they referred to as the 7 Years' War in Europe, causes the American Revolution. You and I, we can all relate to this. America, is in trillions of dollars of debt. One simply needs to look at the debt calculator, or the debt clock, to see this. A significant portion of that, not all by any means, but a significant portion, is from the wars that you and I have lived through. The wars in the Middle East, etc. You and I, as well as our descendants, will be paying that off through taxes, etc. Somewhat of a depressing note, to be sure, but nevertheless, it's still truth. The British have a similar problem. Because of this debt, the British Parliament asked the question, well, who is going to benefit the most from the results of the French and Indian War? See, the French, following the conclusion of that conflict, the French were removed from North America. And that is the British colonists. Parliament argues that because they're going to benefit the most, they should at least bear some of this burden in paying the debt back. Additionally, they're going to continue to hold troops in the Americas, which is going to add to that expense. War is expensive, to be sure. Now, of course, the main catalyst here is debt, and I ask my students to further expand on that. They can't simply answer that by one word, and of course, I will further expand on that as well. But here's the thing, before we go any further, we have to understand something about the world in which they lived. In other words, the context. And so one of the things I think is important to note before we look at any of the taxes or the policies that were put forth by the British, we have to ask, How did they see themselves? And this can really be described by something, if you've studied history before, called the Rights of Englishmen. In other words, for centuries, Englishmen had felt as though they had certain fundamental rights that were just inherently theirs, that they fought for many times. We can trace this back to the Magna Carta, centuries before the American Revolution. And of course, to broadly describe that document and what the contention was the fact that they wanted the king to acknowledge that Englishmen had certain rights, that the king could not simply rule arbitrarily, that he had to adhere to certain laws put forth. And one of these, for instance, a great example, is that Englishmen have a right to a trial by a jury of one's peers. Now, this is going to be a consistent theme and will play a role in what we're about to discuss, and which is why I bring it up, right? You can go further all the way into the Glorious Revolution of the latter part of the 17th century. Out of that conflict, you get an English Bill of Rights, by the way, heavily influencing our own, right? Ours is not just American, it is English as well. And in that is a reaffirmation that Englishmen have a right to a trial by a jury of their peers. And of course, well, some of the other contentions have been who has the most influence in terms of new taxes throughout English history. And you see in the English Bill of Rights in the following the Glorious Revolution that Parliament has a lot more influence in that document. It's always been a contention between the Crown and Parliament. And so this brings us to the origins of the American Revolution. And so we started off with debt. We know we have to create some new revenue. And so let's look at one of the policies and see how this all ties together. The first was the Sugar Act of 1764. And this was simply an extension of the earlier Molasses Act. They were drunks by the standards of today. They were drunks back then, to be sure. They drank a lot compared to today, again, of course. And one of the things that they drank was rum. What is a primary ingredient in rum? Well, it is molasses. And molasses is a derivative of sugar cane, which is widely grown back then in the West Indies. And all of these countries had holdings in the West Indies, the French, the Spanish, etc. The Molasses Act put a tax on foreign molasses imported into the American colonies. Now, this was not primarily to create revenue. This was a concept, a manifestation of the concept of mercantilism. And all it basically meant was we are going to regulate trade so it benefits our country. And so, for instance, if the British molasses was more expensive, I would go to the French and I would trade with the French to bring in that molasses. And the tax on that foreign molasses was meant to say to individuals, don't buy from the French or someone else, buy from the British, buy from your own countrymen, right? Help us each other, the empire. And of course, I don't want to, right? Because it is more expensive. And so instead of paying the tax even, I'm going to simply smuggle it in from the French or whoever else. This was not the big deal probably that it would become under the Sugar Act. Okay. Of course, people were prosecuted, but many times the British Empire had been busy elsewhere. Did not pay a whole lot of attention to what is going on in terms of smuggling. They did, for certain, right? I hate to oversimplify this, but in a comparative analysis, it's very different from the kind of enforcement that they're thinking of with the Sugar Act. And this brings us to the Sugar Act, right, of 1764. So it's an extension of the Molasses Act. It actually taxes other things as well, but we're going to focus on molasses for simplicity. It actually reduces the tax on molasses from 6 pence a gallon to 3. Not bad, right? We like a reduction in taxes, just as we do today. And so what is the argument? What is the problem? Where is that contention? And there's a couple things. One of them is that if you were caught smuggling in foreign molasses, now, rather than having the opportunity to stand trial by a jury of one's peers, you are going to stand trial in a vice admiralty court under that act, which is basically all it means is you are going to stand before one judge who will determine your fate rather than the jury. And there's a reason for this. Of course, the jury of my peers were my fellow smugglers, were people that were sympathetic to me or benefited, right, from my smuggling in some way. So the jury of one's peers was not always effective. With the Sugar Act, why do I put that in there? Because once again, I need that revenue because of debt. Now this is from their perspective a threat to their fundamental rights, as Englishmen. So you see how this becomes much more complex, and context plays a role. My students, I have them do a research paper, evidence-based research paper every semester. And because they're in college and they're getting close to hopefully finding employment in a field that they are going to college for, right? I hope we're preparing them well. And because employers want individuals who are going to add new concepts, new arguments to better the organization for which they are working, I have them try and at least start, right, finding the ways to make new arguments through evidence, etc. Employers also want individuals to be able to convey those findings, to express them. And so I have them do a presentation explaining the findings of their research. I had two students that did such an excellent job. And basically they were making the argument there's a reason that it is the British that rebel first, rather than the French or the Spanish colonies. No, there's a reason the British did. And to illustrate this point is they took candy and they divided the class into two, handed everybody candy, and then they picked up half of the class's candy while we all sat and watched the other half eat theirs. Not a very popular move, to be sure, but God, it was such a great exemplification of what we are talking about. That Englishmen had certain rights that you might not find in the French colonies or the Spanish in the Americas, right? Are you more or less likely to be angry, to want something if you had it and lost it? Pardon me. As opposed to if you had it, never lost it, or perhaps never had it at all. Of course, if you had it and lost it. And from the British perspective, they had these rights as Englishmen, once again tracing back centuries earlier to the Magna Carta, and throughout the centuries being fought for, refought for, and reaffirmed in things such as the Glorious Revolution, the English Bill of Rights that came to fruition after the Glorious Revolution. So the fact that they are taking away this right to a trial by jury of one's peers in regards to tax evasion in some of these policies is significant for more than just taxes. But of course, reality is also there as well. We cannot discount the economic factor because these individuals, right, they made rum, they exported. I mean, this was a very important part of certain regions' economy. And so these taxes and the fact that maybe I won't be able to evade them as I have in the past, the economic factor is certainly there. So we cannot discount taxation. But we also see that it is much more complex as well. One more policy, if I may, and I assure you that will be the last one. The Stamp Act. The Stamp Act of 1765 basically was the first instance where you start to see these taxes very much differentiate themselves from the prior taxes before. And this is what I want to explain. Because you see mass outrage in terms of the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act basically put a tax, or rather a stamp on paper that we had to pay for, basically, on every piece of paper throughout the colonies that was sold, etc. So, for instance, if you will, little Johnny going to buy playing cards, tax. The individual going to buy a pamphlet, a newspaper, tax. For lack of a better word, this internal tax was very, very personal. It was the type of tax that the American colonists typically associated with their own elected assemblies levying on them. Of course, in addition to this, once again, if I'm caught evading this, you stand trial before a vice admiralty court, not that jury. So the complexities once again come in. How can we compare this, though? What is the contrast between this tax that explains the outrage and this call for no taxation without representation? Of course, they would have said that much more eloquently than I did in that time, as the primary sources reveal. Because prior to this, if I am a tobacco planter, let's say, growing a cash crop, whatever it is, indigo, rice, but we'll do tobacco because that became an enumerated good, I would export that to England to be sold either in England or in Europe, but part of enumerated goods were they had to be sold or brought to England first so they could be taxed. And I don't want to say I'm okay with this, but I'm okay with this. Right? So in other words, nobody ever liked the taxes. You had people smuggling or trying to evade it, or perhaps growing a different crop to avoid certain taxes. But this, compared to the Stamp Act, was an acceptable form of that concept of mercantilism, where Britain was going to be regulating trade for the benefit of the empire. We're all making money, presumably, for at least a majority of the time. So I'm relatively okay with this. And because I'm trading with England, I accept the fact that it was the British Parliament where I lack a representative in that body. It's okay that they are placing that on me. To some degree, of course, right? Again, I oversimplify it for the purposes of this video. The Stamp Act is where you see that differentiation, where now this tax has become very personal, something that I say, if you're going to place such a personal tax in there, we want representation in that body they call Parliament. Of course, from the British perspective, what do they say? They say, well, you are part of the British Empire, so we all represent you. Right? I don't think that made anyone feel better. It would be similar to, a comparison would be Washington, D.C. today. So for instance, you and I, if we live in one of these 50 states, we elect representatives in our state and we send them to Washington, D.C. to sit in Congress to represent us. Washington, D.C. itself, the residents of that federal district, lack that representation. Actually, full disclosure, right, they have a delegate in the House that, but that delegate lacks full voting rights, etc. So in other words, they really don't have the representation that you and I have. The argument for that is, pardon me, well, the practical argument is that where do all of these representatives from all these 50 states, where do they live half the year? Well, Washington, D.C. So arguably, they all represent Washington, D.C. Of course, I'm sure that does not make them feel much better in Washington, D.C. Nevertheless, what Parliament would have called this to the British colonists at that time, the American colonists, is virtual representation. So here you start to see that contention. Of course, the Sugar Act would be amended, so they will actually reduce the tax because of the non-importation, the boycott, etc., British goods. Right? We cannot discount economic factors, how they related to politics. The Stamp Act would be repealed anyways, shortly after it would go into effect, and it never actually went into effect where you saw stamped paper. And those tensions, nevertheless, would escalate. They would continue. But here you see the origins of this, arguably without debt, right? Without the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War, without the subsequent debt that followed, we have none of these discussions about new types of taxes, etc. That arguably you do not have your American Revolution, or it's postponed for some time in the future. Thank you so much for your time.